Do not worry about me, I told my daughter. I have spent 72 years learning how to set a Thanksgiving table. I suppose tonight I will learn how to clear one for myself. Susan did not laugh. There was a silence on the phone long enough for me to hear the faint sound of dishes being moved somewhere in her kitchen. Mom, please do not say it like that. Like what? Like we are abandoning you. I looked across my dining room at 8 place settings arranged around the walnut table my husband, George, bought when David was still small enough to need a booster seat. The good china was out. Cloth napkins were folded beside each plate. In the kitchen, a 12-pound turkey rested in the refrigerator, already seasoned for the morning. I did not say anyone was abandoning me, I replied. Plans change. Susan explained everything again. Her husband Mark's sister had invited them to Thanksgiving at the last minute. Their gathering would include relatives they had not seen in years, and driving the 60 miles to my house afterward would make the day complicated. I thought David was still coming, she said. He had a change of plans too. Another silence. What about Emily? I believe she is spending the afternoon with friends. Mom, I can call her. Do not rearrange everybody's holiday because of me. But you already bought everything. Food keeps. That was not entirely true, at least not in the way Thanksgiving food was supposed to keep. Turkey was meant to be carved while people argued over dark meat and white meat. Dinner rolls were supposed to disappear before anyone admitted taking the last one. Pumpkin pie tasted better when somebody insisted the first slice was too large and then accepted it anyway. Still, I had no intention of making Susan feel worse. We will come next weekend, she promised. I know. I love you. I love you too. After we hung up, I placed my phone beside the flour canister and returned to the pie crust I had been making. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, butter, and the onions I had chopped for stuffing. Outside the window, late November leaves moved across the backyard in the Pennsylvania wind. George had planted the maple near the fence 41 years earlier. Every autumn he complained about the leaves, and every spring he told me how beautiful the tree was. He had been gone 8 years, but some conversations refuse to leave a house just because one person does. David had called that morning. His wife, Karen, had received an invitation to a Thanksgiving gathering hosted by one of her company's senior executives. It could be important for her career, he explained. They lived about 90 miles away, and trying to attend both dinners would mean spending most of Thanksgiving on the highway. Susan will be there with you, right? He had asked. I could have corrected him. Instead, I said, you enjoy yourself. At the time, I still believed Susan was coming. By lunchtime, she was not. Emily texted around 3. She was 24 and had recently moved into her first apartment near Philadelphia. She sent a photograph of a pie she had attempted to bake with friends. The crust was uneven and the filling looked suspiciously liquid. I told her it looked wonderful. She replied that she hoped Uncle David brought me one that was actually edible. That was when I understood the problem. David thought Susan would be here. Susan thought David would be here. Emily thought both of them would be here. Every person who loved me believed another person was taking care of loving me that day. I stood in the kitchen holding my phone and almost laughed at the efficiency of it. Nobody had decided that Maggie Bennett should spend Thanksgiving alone. Somehow, they had managed it anyway. I considered calling them. I could have told David the truth. I could have asked Susan to reconsider. Emily would probably have driven the 100 miles if she knew. But I had spent most of my adult life trying not to make love feel like an obligation. So I finished the pumpkin pie. Then I made the pecan pie because George had always insisted one dessert was evidence of poor planning. I prepared the green bean casserole, peeled potatoes, and set the cranberry sauce in the refrigerator. By Wednesday evening, my kitchen looked ready to feed 8 people even though only one person was expected. I finally walked into the dining room and looked at the place cards. David, Karen, Susan, Mark, Emily. 2 other family members who had already cancelled earlier in the week. Mine sat at the end nearest the kitchen. I began collecting them one by one. I put the extra plates back into the cabinet. 8 became 6. 6 became 4. 4 became 1. That was the moment the house finally felt quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet. There is a difference. I turned off the dining room light and went upstairs. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear. I was awake before 6 out of habit. For 37 years, Thanksgiving in our house had begun before sunrise. I made coffee, tied on my burgundy apron, and turned on the oven. I could have left the turkey in the refrigerator. Instead, I cooked everything. Maybe routine was stubbornness. Maybe it was comfort. By 10:30, the house smelled exactly as it had when George was alive and the children were young. I reached for the cream to finish the mashed potatoes and discovered the carton was nearly empty. Of course, I said to myself. The grocery store downtown would close at noon. I put on my cream cardigan, grabbed my purse, and drove the 3 miles into town. Miller's Market had been there longer than I had. Thomas Reed was near the register when I walked inside. I had known Thomas since he was 17 and convinced he would never amount to anything because his grades were poor. He was 38 now and owned the hardware store 2 doors down. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, smiling. "Happy Thanksgiving. You feeding the whole Bennett army today?" I picked up a small carton of heavy cream. "Not this year. Everybody going somewhere else." Plans changed. He studied my face. "So who is coming over?" I smiled and placed the cream on the counter. "It will be a quiet year, Thomas." He did not ask another question. I paid, wished him a happy Thanksgiving, and walked back toward my car. I never saw him take out his phone before I reached the parking lot. By the time I returned from Miller's Market, I had convinced myself that a quiet Thanksgiving might actually be pleasant. That was the story I told myself while carrying the carton of heavy cream. Into the kitchen. No rushing to keep the gravy warm. No searching for extra chairs. No debate over whether the turkey needed another 15 minutes. I could eat whenever I wanted, leave the dishes until morning, and watch an old movie without anyone complaining that I had fallen asleep halfway through it. At 72, I had learned that disappointment became easier to carry when you gave it a practical name. I called mine a change of plans. I set the cream beside the stove and checked the turkey. The skin had turned golden brown, and the little thermometer beside the roasting pan told me everything was moving on schedule. Habit is a stubborn thing. Even alone, I basted the turkey exactly the way George had taught me, although he had always claimed I taught him. By noon, the mashed potatoes were finished, the green bean casserole was warming, and both pies were lined up on the counter. There was enough food for a family gathering that no longer existed. I considered packing half of it away before dinner, but something stopped me. Maybe I was not ready to make the empty chairs official. I carried the serving dishes into the dining room anyway. The table looked absurd with one place setting and enough food for 8 people. I almost put the other plates back out simply because the table looked more natural that way. Instead, I sat down with a cup of coffee and looked toward the family photographs on the sideboard. There was David at 17, wearing a graduation gown and refusing to smile properly. Susan stood beside him at 14 with braces and a haircut she spent the next 20 years pretending never happened. Emily appeared in newer photographs, usually beside me in the library where I had worked for almost 3 decades. People often assumed I had simply checked books in and out. I never corrected them. The truth was that a small-town library required everyone to do a little of everything. I helped teenagers fill out college applications because many of their parents had never completed one. I showed retirees how to use email. I helped people write resumes when the paper mill reduced its workforce. During one particularly cold January, we turned the meeting room into a collection point for coats, canned food, and space heaters. None of that seemed extraordinary at the time. Someone needed help, and I happened to be standing nearby. That was usually enough. My phone rang shortly after 1. It was Emily. "Happy Thanksgiving, Grandma." "Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart." There was laughter behind her and the sound of music. "Did Uncle David get there yet?" I looked at the empty driveway through the front window. No. He is probably running late. That is basically his personality. I smiled. Probably. "How is the turkey?" "Too large." That has never stopped us before. She told me about the dinner she and her friends were making. Their turkey was only 7 pounds, but they had somehow bought enough potatoes to feed a football team. I listened as she described their kitchen disaster and resisted the urge to ask why she had assumed I was surrounded by family without checking. She was young. At 24, Thanksgiving still felt like something adults arranged in the background while you showed up wherever you had promised to be. "I will call tonight," she said. "You do that." When the call ended, I carried my coffee to the front porch. The temperature was around 40 degrees, cold enough that I pulled my cardigan tighter around myself. Our street was nearly empty. Most cars were already parked in driveways, and through neighboring windows I could see movement around dining tables. Somewhere nearby, someone was laughing loudly enough that I could hear it through a closed door. George and I had spent 42 Thanksgivings together. Some had been crowded. Some had been difficult. One year the oven stopped working and we finished the turkey at our neighbor's house. Another year David brought home a college roommate who had nowhere else to go. George never asked whether there was enough food. He simply added another chair. After he died, I kept doing the same thing. There was always room for one more. At 2:30, I finally carved a few slices of turkey and placed a small portion of everything on my plate. I had just poured gravy over the potatoes when the doorbell rang. For one foolish second, I thought David had changed his mind. I wiped my hands on my apron and hurried toward the front door. When I opened it, Thomas Reed stood on the porch holding a covered casserole dish. "Thomas?" "My mother made too many sweet potatoes," he said. "That woman has never made too much of anything in her life." He smiled. "She told me to bring these anyway." I looked past him toward his pickup truck. "You should be with your family. They are 5 minutes away. I can survive." He handed me the dish, but instead of leaving, he glanced toward the dining room. "You really are eating alone?" It was not a question. I am perfectly capable of feeding myself. "I know." His expression softened. "You remember helping me with my college application?" "You mean the application you tried to throw in the library trash?" "That one." "You were dramatic at 17. I was terrified." He looked down at the porch boards for a moment. "You sat with me for 3 hours because I thought nobody like me belonged in college." I remembered the afternoon, though I had not thought about it in years. "You did the work, Thomas. You made me believe there was work worth doing." I did not know what to say to that. Thomas stepped backward toward the stairs. "Enjoy the sweet potatoes, Mrs. Bennett." "Thank you. And do not start dessert yet." I narrowed my eyes. "Why?" He smiled in a way I did not trust. "Just a suggestion." Before I could question him, he walked toward his truck. I carried the casserole into the kitchen, wondering what he meant. 5 minutes later, another car turned into my driveway. The second car belonged to Linda Morales, who had taught 3rd grade at the elementary school for more than 30 years. I recognized her before she stepped out because she still drove the same blue sedan she had owned when we worked together on the library literacy program. She opened the passenger door and lifted out a pie carrier. "Linda, what are you doing here?" I asked when she reached the porch. "Delivering apple pie. On Thanksgiving. Apparently that is when people eat it. You have family waiting for you. They can survive 10 minutes without me." She handed me the pie and looked past my shoulder into the house. "Thomas called you, did he not?" I asked. Linda suddenly became very interested in adjusting her scarf. Thomas talks too much. Linda. He mentioned you were having a quiet Thanksgiving. That is a polite way of saying he told half the town I was alone. Not half. She paused. Not yet. I should have been annoyed, but Linda's expression made it difficult. You remember the winter my husband lost his job? She asked. Of course I remembered. It had been nearly 20 years earlier. Linda had come into the library looking for tax forms and ended up sitting across from me for almost an hour because she did not know how they would make their mortgage payment. I helped her husband update his resume and showed him where several nearby companies were hiring. That was all. At least, that was how I remembered it. You brought groceries to our house twice, Linda said. You told everyone they came from the library holiday drive so we would not feel embarrassed. I had forgotten that part. You would have done the same. Maybe. But you actually did. She hugged me before leaving, then pointed toward the pie. Do not eat the whole thing. At my age, I consider advice optional. Linda laughed and headed back to her car. I carried the pie inside and placed it beside the pumpkin and pecan pies. 3 desserts for one woman seemed excessive even by Thanksgiving standards. I had barely returned to my plate when the doorbell rang again. This time it was Reverend Paul Harris from the Methodist Church, although I was not a member of his congregation. He carried a basket of dinner rolls. Behind him stood his wife, Carol, holding flowers. Let me guess, I said. Thomas. Paul smiled. Actually, Linda. This town needs better hobbies. Carol handed me the flowers. You helped our daughter with her scholarship applications. That was 12 years ago. She is a physical therapist in Pittsburgh now. I know. She sends Christmas cards. Paul looked toward the dining room. We thought you might need rolls. I glanced at the basket. I already have 12. Then you have 24. They stayed only a few minutes, but after they left I stopped trying to eat. Something was happening, and I had the uncomfortable feeling I was the last person to understand it. I picked up my phone and considered calling Thomas. Before I could, another vehicle pulled up. Then another. A young couple from the pharmacy brought cranberry relish. Mr. Jenkins, who had retired from the post office, delivered a pan of macaroni and cheese his daughter had made. Rachel Kim, the current library director, appeared carrying a container of stuffing and wearing the expression of someone caught participating in a conspiracy. Rachel, I said, you are supposed to stop this. I am afraid I cannot. You run the library. Exactly. I know how many people have your phone number. She stepped inside and placed the stuffing on my kitchen counter. Rachel had started at the library as a part-time assistant when she was 22. I trained her, although she eventually became far better at the job than I ever was. Thomas called me around 11:30, she admitted. He asked whether I knew you were alone. And apparently you declared a municipal emergency. I made 3 phone calls. How many calls did those people make? I have no idea. I stared at her. Rachel tried not to smile. Maggie, you spent 28 years helping people in this town. Did you really think nobody remembered? I never expected anyone to remember. That is probably why they do. She helped me move several dishes into the kitchen because the dining table was becoming crowded. While we worked, she told me people had started exchanging messages after Thomas called. Nobody had organized anything formally. There was no plan, no list, and certainly no invitation. People simply heard that I was alone and decided to stop by before or after their own Thanksgiving meals. I do not want anyone leaving their families because of me, I said. They are not leaving their families. They are visiting you. There is a difference. A very large one. Rachel left shortly before 3:30. I stood at the front window watching her drive away and noticed something unusual. 2 cars were parked along the curb that I did not recognize. A third turned onto my street and slowed near my house. For the first time that day, I felt genuinely nervous. My kitchen counters were covered with food I had not prepared. Flowers sat in George's old ceramic pitcher because I could not find another vase. My quiet Thanksgiving was becoming less quiet by the minute. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily asking whether Uncle David had finally arrived. I started typing the truth, then stopped. Before I could decide what to tell her, the doorbell rang again. When I opened the door, Thomas was back. This time he was not carrying food. He had 2 folded chairs under one arm and 4 more stacked in the bed of his pickup. "Thomas Reed," I said, "why are you bringing chairs to my house?" He looked toward the street behind him. I followed his gaze. Several people were walking toward my porch carrying covered dishes, flowers, and grocery bags. Another car pulled in behind them. Thomas set the chairs down and gave me the same expression he used at 17 whenever he knew he had done something I was about to question. "Because, Mrs. Bennett," he said, "I have a feeling you are going to need them." I stared at the folding chairs, then at the people coming up my walkway, and for the first time all day I had absolutely no idea what to say. Thomas seemed to enjoy that more than he should have. "You could start by opening the door a little wider," he suggested. "You are becoming very confident for someone whose college application I corrected with a red pen. You used a blue pen." Then my memory is slipping. He laughed and carried the chairs inside. The first group included Janet Collins, who owned the bakery on Main Street, her husband, Frank, and their neighbor, Harold Green, a retired accountant I had known since George was alive. Janet carried 2 trays of dinner rolls. Frank had a large container of roasted vegetables. Harold held a pumpkin pie even though 3 pies were already sitting in my kitchen. "We heard you had room at the table," Janet said. "I apparently have more food than table. That can be fixed." Thomas unfolded 2 chairs while Frank moved the coffee table closer to the living room wall. I watched them rearrange my house with the confidence of people who had forgotten to ask permission. Strangely, I did not stop them. Another knock came before everyone had removed their coats. Rachel returned with her husband and a stack of paper plates. "I thought you went home," I said. "I did." "And?" My husband asked why I had left you here alone. Her husband raised one hand. I may have expressed the question more strongly. Within 15 minutes, 9 people were standing in my living room. Nobody seemed to know who had officially invited whom because, apparently, nobody had. Thomas had called Rachel. Rachel mentioned it to Linda. Linda told Carol Harris. Janet heard from a customer picking up dinner rolls. Somewhere along the way, the simple fact that Maggie Bennett was spending Thanksgiving alone had traveled farther than I had driven all week. "This is ridiculous," I said as Thomas brought in another chair. "You are all supposed to be with your families." Janet looked around the room. "Some of them are coming too." "What?" The doorbell rang again. By 4:15, my driveway was full. Cars lined both sides of the street, and my front porch looked like a collection point for every casserole dish in Pennsylvania. People did not arrive empty-handed. They brought turkey, stuffing, sweet potatoes, corn pudding, macaroni and cheese, cranberry sauce, rolls, pies, flowers, coffee, and enough whipped cream to cover my dining table. A firefighter named Marcus Hill arrived off duty carrying 4 folding chairs borrowed from the station. I remembered Marcus as a teenager who spent nearly every afternoon at the library because his mother worked until 6. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, setting the chairs beside the wall, "you still make terrible hot chocolate. It came from a packet." "Exactly. You drank it. It was free." We both laughed. Then his expression softened. "You kept the library open late when I was studying for my entrance exams. The building was open until 8 anyway. Not on Fridays." I remembered those evenings only vaguely. Marcus remembered them perfectly. That became the pattern. Every person who walked through my door seemed to carry a memory I had misplaced years earlier. Janet remembered when I helped her research small business loans before she opened the bakery. Harold remembered George and me bringing meals after his wife had surgery. A woman named Denise Carter reminded me that I had helped her daughter complete financial aid forms when neither of them understood the paperwork. Rachel found an old photograph on my bookshelf from a library food drive and held it up for several people to see. "You organized this," she said. "The library organized it." "Maggie, you were the library." "That seems unfair to the building." People laughed, but I felt something tighten in my throat. I had never thought of those years as a collection of favors. Life had simply placed people in front of me, and when I could help, I helped. George used to tease me about it. He would come home and find an unfamiliar casserole dish in our refrigerator because someone needed dinner, or discover a teenager at our kitchen table working on an essay. He never complained. He only asked whether he should make more coffee. At 4:30, Thomas stood in the doorway between the dining room and living room and counted heads. 23. 23 what? I asked. People. I can see that. We need another table. We need another house. Frank disappeared and returned 10 minutes later with a 6-foot folding table from the community center. Someone found tablecloths. Someone else organized the food. My carefully arranged Thanksgiving dinner had transformed into something I could never have planned. People sat wherever there was space. Dining chairs, folding chairs, the couch, kitchen stools, even the bench George had built for the front hallway. I stood near the kitchen doorway watching strangers and old friends pass plates across my house as though they had been doing it for years. Thomas came beside me. "You all did this because you heard I was alone?" I asked. "Pretty much." "That is foolish." "Probably. You should be with your own families." He looked around. "A lot of these people brought their families." "That is not what I mean." Thomas became serious. "You spent years making sure nobody in this town had to feel forgotten. We figured Thanksgiving was a bad day to let it happen to you." For once, I had no clever answer. I looked toward the dining room where Rachel was cutting Janet's apple pie. Marcus was helping Harold with a chair. Linda had returned and was arguing with Carol over whose sweet potatoes were better. My quiet house had become so loud that George would have loved every second of it. Then my phone rang. Emily's name appeared on the screen. I stepped into the kitchen and answered. "Hi, sweetheart." "Grandma, what is that noise?" "What noise?" Someone in the living room laughed loudly enough to ruin my attempt at innocence. "Are you having a party?" Emily asked. "Not intentionally." "Where are you?" "At home." "Who is there?" I looked through the doorway at more than 20 people crowded around the Thanksgiving meal my family had believed someone else would share with me. A few people from town stopped by. Emily was silent. "Grandma," she finally said, "is Uncle David there?" I looked toward the empty chair that had originally been meant for my son. "No." "Aunt Susan?" "No." Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Emily was beginning to understand. "Wait," she said quietly. "Were you alone today?" "Were you alone today?" Emily asked again, and this time there was no laughter behind her voice. I looked through the kitchen doorway at Thomas unfolding another chair while Linda carried a bowl toward the dining room. "For part of the day," I said. "Grandma, why did you not tell me?" "Because you had plans." "I thought Uncle David and Aunt Susan were there." "David thought Susan was here." "Susan thought David was here." "You thought both of them were here." Emily became completely silent. "So nobody came?" "Not from the family." I immediately regretted how sharp that sounded. "That came out wrong." "No," she said quietly. "It did not." I heard movement on her end of the call, then a door closing. The background noise disappeared. "I should have called yesterday." "You called today." "That is not the same thing." Emily, you are with your friends. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. How many people are at your house? I looked around. Thomas had stopped counting after 23, and several more people had arrived since then. Enough that I may need to start charging admission. She did not laugh. Who are they? People from town. They just showed up. Apparently I have become a community project. Grandma. Yes, they showed up. Her voice changed when she asked the next question. Because they found out you were alone. I hesitated. Yes. Another silence followed. I have to go, Emily said. Do not do anything dramatic. I am your granddaughter. Dramatic is hereditary. Before I could answer, she ended the call. I stood there holding the phone, knowing exactly what she was about to do. 3 minutes later, Susan called. Mom, were you alone? There was no greeting. Emily works quickly. Why did you tell me David was not coming? I did tell you. You said he had a change of plans. I thought someone else was coming. Who? Susan had no answer. That was the problem in its simplest form. There had always been an imaginary someone else. Someone else would call. Someone else would visit. Someone else would notice. Mom, I am so sorry. Susan, I am fine. You made dinner for everybody. I make too much food when people are coming and apparently when they are not. This is not funny. I am not sure what you want me to say. Her voice softened. Tell me you are angry. I looked toward the dining room. 20 years earlier, I probably would have been. At 72, anger felt less useful than clarity. I was hurt, I said. There is a difference. Susan breathed out slowly. I should have checked. Yes. I did not rescue her from that truth. Parents spend years protecting their children from unnecessary pain, but guilt is not always unnecessary. Sometimes it tells us where we stop paying attention. I assumed David would be there, she said. And he assumed you would. That sounds terrible when you say it out loud. Most mistakes do. We can leave here right now. No. Mom, it is only about an hour. You are with Mark's family. Stay there. But I want to come. Then come because you want to see me, not because you are trying to erase what happened. Susan became quiet again. There is a difference. A very large one. I realized I was repeating Rachel's words from earlier. Susan promised to call again and hung up. David called less than 5 minutes later. I almost let it go to voicemail simply because I knew the conversation before answering. Mom. Hello, David. I just talked to Emily. Of course you did. Why did you not call me? Why did you not call me? That stopped him. I called yesterday. You called to tell me you were not coming. I thought Susan was there. Everyone thought someone was here. He exhaled. Karen and I can leave. No. We are 90 miles away, but traffic is light. Stay where you are. Mom, please. I looked at the crowded rooms again. Something unexpected had happened inside me. I was no longer embarrassed that people knew I had been alone. I was embarrassed that I had almost treated their kindness as something inconvenient. David, my house is full. Full. There are people sitting on folding chairs in the hallway. Who? Half the town, apparently. What do you mean, half the town? I laughed. I am exaggerating. Probably. Thomas walked into the kitchen carrying an empty serving bowl. Mrs. Bennett, we have another problem. What now? We are out of gravy. David heard him. Who was that? Thomas Reed. The hardware store guy. He has appointed himself chairman of Thanksgiving. Thomas pointed toward the stove. Can you save us? Give me 10 minutes. David sounded confused. Mom, what exactly is happening there? I am still trying to figure that out. When we ended the call, I made another batch of gravy while Thomas stood beside me stirring it badly enough that I eventually took the spoon away from him. By 5:30, more than 30 people had passed through my front door. Some stayed. Some dropped off food and returned to their own gatherings. Others brought relatives I had never met. Nobody behaved as though they were rescuing a lonely old woman. That mattered to me. They behaved as though they had simply decided my table was one of the places they wanted to be. Rachel tapped a glass with a spoon and asked everyone to quiet down. Before we eat again, she announced, Thomas wants to say something. No, I do not. Thomas replied. Everyone laughed. He stood anyway. I only made one phone call this morning, he said. Maybe two. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Fine, 3. But everybody else came because they wanted to. He looked at me. Mrs. Bennett spent years opening doors for people in this town. Today we found out hers was open and decided to walk through it. The room became quiet. I looked at faces I had known for decades and faces I barely recognized. Then headlights swept across the front window. A car pulled quickly into the driveway. Thomas glanced outside. Expecting anyone? Not anymore, I said. The front door opened before I reached it. Emily stepped inside carrying her coat over one arm, her hair slightly windblown from the drive. She looked around at the crowded house, then directly at me. I know you told me not to do anything dramatic, she said. I ignored you. Emily crossed the room and wrapped her arms around me before I could say anything clever enough to protect either of us from the moment. I am sorry, she whispered. You drove all the way from Philadelphia because you feel guilty? I asked. Partly. She pulled back and looked at me. Mostly because I wanted to see you. That is a better answer. She glanced around the living room, where nearly every available chair had been claimed. Who are all these people? I was hoping you could tell me. Thomas appeared beside us carrying 2 plates. You must be Emily. And you must be the man who told the entire state of Pennsylvania my grandmother was alone. Only the county. Thomas, I warned. Emily laughed for the first time since arriving. He handed her a plate and disappeared toward the kitchen. Emily stayed close to me as we moved through the house, and I began introducing her to people she had heard me mention but had never really known. Marcus Hill told her about the Friday evenings he spent studying at the library while I kept the lights on for him. Janet Collins explained how I helped her research financing when the bakery was still nothing more than an idea written in a notebook. Denise Carter told Emily that I sat beside her daughter for 2 afternoons while they completed financial aid forms. Your grandmother never made people feel like they were asking for help, Denise said. She made you feel like you were solving something together. Emily looked at me as though she had discovered a room in my house that had always been locked. Why have you never told me any of this? Because there was not much to tell. Marcus nearly dropped his fork. Not much. I worked at a library. Mrs. Bennett, you practically raised half the teenagers who passed through that building. That is an exaggeration. Rachel walked past us carrying a pie server. It is not. Emily smiled, but her eyes were wet. I touched her arm. Do not turn me into a saint. I was occasionally very unpleasant about overdue books. She charged me $42 once, Thomas called from the dining room. You kept a history book for 6 months. I was emotionally attached to it. The room erupted in laughter, and something about that sound loosened the knot I had carried since morning. Emily helped me refill coffee cups and collect empty plates. As we worked, people continued telling stories. Some I remembered immediately. Others had disappeared completely from my memory. A man named Robert Ellis reminded me that I had helped him prepare for a job interview after the manufacturing plant where he worked closed. He had arrived at the library wearing jeans because he did not own a suit. George had given him one of his. Your grandfather told me it was too small for him, Robert told Emily. It was not. I saw him wear it the previous Christmas. I had never known George had said that. Emily looked toward the photograph of him on the bookshelf. Grandpa did that? Apparently. Robert nodded. I got the job. I wore that suit to work on my first day even though nobody else wore suits. We laughed, and then Robert said something that stayed with me. Your grandparents were good at helping without making you feel small. Emily became quiet. Around 6:30, several guests began leaving to return to their own homes. They packed leftovers into containers and somehow still left me with more food than I had started with. Before Linda left, she hugged Emily and said, "Take care of this woman. She spent years taking care of everyone else." Emily nodded without defending herself. That told me how deeply the day had affected her. When the crowd thinned to about 15 people, headlights appeared outside again. Emily looked through the front window. That is Mom's car. Susan and Mark stepped onto the porch carrying coats and an unopened bottle of sparkling cider. Susan entered slowly, almost as though she needed permission to walk into the house where she had grown up. I did not make her ask. I hugged her. "I am sorry," she said immediately. "I know." She looked around at the folding tables, half-empty serving dishes, flowers, and strangers talking comfortably in my living room. "All these people came for you." "Apparently." Thomas raised his hand from across the room. "Some of us came for the pie." Susan smiled faintly, but the embarrassment remained in her face. Then Rachel approached and introduced herself. Susan remembered her name from the library. Within minutes, she was hearing the same stories Emily had heard. I watched my daughter discover pieces of my life that had existed outside motherhood. Children often know their parents through a narrow doorway. They remember who packed lunches, paid bills, corrected homework, complained about messy bedrooms, and waited up when they came home late. They rarely imagine that the same person has spent entire decades being someone else to other people. Susan listened as Janet described the bakery loan research. She listened as Marcus talked about those late Fridays. Then Harold showed her an old photograph Rachel had found on my bookshelf. It showed me standing outside the library beside a truck filled with donated winter coats. Susan stared at it. "I remember that coat drive," she said. "You complained because Dad was storing boxes in the garage. I was trying to park my car. You never told us you organized it." "I did not organize it alone." Susan looked at me. "Mom, I do not think I knew half of your life." There was no accusation in her voice. That made the sentence heavier. "You were busy living yours," I said. "That is what children are supposed to do. Not so busy that we stop seeing yours." Before I could answer, another pair of headlights crossed the curtains. A dark sport utility vehicle pulled into the last open space near the curb. Emily looked outside, then turned toward me. "Uncle David." I checked the clock. It was almost 7:30. David had driven nearly 90 miles. A moment later, he stepped through the front door with Karen beside him. He stopped when he saw the people still gathered around the house. His eyes moved from the folding chairs to the food, then to Susan, Emily, and finally me. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I owe you an apology." I looked at my 3 family members standing together in the house where they had all assumed someone else would be. "You probably do," I said. "But first, take off your coat. There are some people I think you need to meet." David removed his coat slowly, and Karen followed him into the living room with the careful expression of someone entering a conversation that had started hours earlier. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Thomas walked over and held out a plate. "You are Maggie's son." "David." "Thomas Reed." David recognized the name immediately. "My mother helped you with college." Thomas smiled. "Your mother helped me believe college was possible." David looked at me, but Thomas was already leading him toward the dining room. Karen stayed beside Susan and Emily while I poured fresh coffee. I could tell my children were uncomfortable, not because anyone had treated them badly, but because every story they heard revealed how much of my life they had stopped noticing. David sat with Marcus for nearly 20 minutes. I could not hear every word, but eventually he came into the kitchen carrying 2 empty plates. Marcus said you used to stay late at the library for him. Occasionally. He said you did it for almost a year. He needed somewhere quiet to study. David placed the plates beside the sink. Why did you never tell us? Would it have changed anything? Maybe I would have understood you better. I dried my hands on a towel. You understood me as your mother. That was enough when you were young. I am not young anymore. No, you certainly are not. He smiled. Briefly, then became serious. I should have called this morning. Yes. I should have asked who was actually coming instead of assuming. Yes. You are not going to make this easier for me, are you? Would that help you remember it? He looked down and shook his head. Probably not. I touched his arm. Then I will not. Around 8, the last guests began gathering their coats. Thomas and Frank folded the extra tables while Rachel packed food into containers. Somehow, everyone insisted on leaving dishes behind. My refrigerator was already full, so Marcus offered to store several casseroles at the fire station until morning. Janet left 24 dinner rolls despite my objections. Freeze them, she said. I am 72, Janet. I may not live long enough to finish all this bread. She stared at me. You are not allowed to make jokes like that after what happened today. Then stop giving me bread. She hugged me so tightly that I laughed. When Thomas finally prepared to leave, I followed him to the porch. The street had grown quiet again. Cold air moved through the bare maple branches, and porch lights glowed along the block. You caused quite a problem today, I told him. I know. My house looks like a church potluck collided with a furniture store. I can come tomorrow and help clean. You will do no such thing. That sounds like a yes. I looked at him for a moment. Thank you. His expression changed. You do not have to thank me. I know. I am doing it anyway. He nodded. You did the same for me once. Filling out an application is not the same as bringing 30 people to someone's house. No. But you taught me that when somebody matters, you show up. He walked down the steps before I could answer. I stood there until his truck disappeared around the corner. When I returned inside, only my family remained. David and Mark were moving chairs back into place. Karen and Susan were washing dishes. Emily was gathering napkins from the living room. It was the Thanksgiving scene I had expected that morning, except it had arrived about 8 hours late and after an entire town had reminded my family where the house was. I sat at the kitchen table and watched them for a while. Susan noticed. You should rest. I am resting. You are supervising. That is more enjoyable. David sat across from me. Mom, can we talk? Susan turned off the faucet. Emily stopped collecting plates. Apparently, everyone understood that he meant all of us. They gathered around the kitchen table where thousands of family conversations had taken place over the years. David spoke first. I think we have been treating you like you are always going to be here. Nobody interrupted him. We call. We visit. We invite you places. But we also assume that if we cannot make something, somebody else will. Susan sat beside him. And today everybody made the same assumption. I did too, Emily said. I am sorry. I looked at the three of them. I know you love me. That almost makes it worse, Susan said. Why? Because none of us meant to hurt you. We did it by being careless. I thought about that. Intentions mattered, but they did not erase consequences. Your father used to say that family relationships rarely fall apart because of one enormous decision, I said. Usually they weaken through small things nobody thinks are important. David nodded slowly. I remember. He also said people can repair small things before they become large ones. Emily leaned forward. Then let us repair this. I smiled. You cannot repair Thanksgiving. It happened. Her face fell slightly. But you can learn from it. Susan reached across the table and took my hand. What do you want us to do differently? That question surprised me more than the crowd had. For years, I had been the one asking everyone else what they needed. I do not want a schedule, I said. I do not want obligatory Sunday calls or people visiting because they are afraid Thomas Reed will organize another parade. They laughed. I want you to stop assuming. If you wonder whether someone else called me, call me yourself. If you wonder whether someone else invited me, ask. Do not outsource caring about people you love. Nobody spoke for several seconds. David finally nodded. That seems fair. Good. Because I am too old to make complicated rules. Emily looked toward the living room, where George's photograph still sat on the bookshelf. Grandpa would have loved today. Every minute of it. Even all those strangers? I smiled. Especially the strangers. Just then, Susan noticed something on the refrigerator door. It was an old photograph held by a faded magnet. George and I stood outside the library beside boxes of donated food, both of us younger than David was now. Susan removed it carefully. Was this another one of those things you never told us about? I looked at the photograph and remembered the winter it was taken. Your father and I thought Thanksgiving should last longer than one Thursday. Emily looked at me. What does that mean? I stood and opened the refrigerator, revealing more leftovers than our family could possibly eat. It means, I said, tomorrow morning, we are going to need some containers. The next morning, my kitchen looked as though Thanksgiving had decided to stay for the weekend. Containers filled every shelf in the refrigerator. 3 pies occupied most of the counter. A tray of dinner rolls sat beside the coffee maker, and someone had left enough macaroni and cheese to feed a high school marching band. I came downstairs shortly after 7 and found Emily already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. You are awake early, I said. I could not sleep. That sounds like guilt. It probably is. I poured myself coffee and sat across from her. Guilt is useful for about 15 minutes. After that, you either learn something or you are just wasting perfectly good misery. Emily smiled. Is that one of Grandpa's sayings? No. Your grandfather believed guilt could be cured with pie. David entered the kitchen wearing the same shirt from the night before, followed by Susan a few minutes later. They had all stayed because nobody wanted to drive home late after such a long day. Karen and Mark were still asleep upstairs. David opened the refrigerator and stared inside. You were serious about the containers. We cannot eat all of this. I can make a respectable attempt. That is not the plan. I explained what George and I used to do after large holiday gatherings. We packed extra meals and delivered them to people we knew were working, living alone, or simply having a difficult week. It was never an official program. There were no sign-up sheets or committees. We just paid attention. So that is what the photograph meant, Susan said. Thanksgiving should last longer than one Thursday. Your father liked sayings that made him sound wiser than he was. David smiled. I remember. By 8:30, all 6 of us were standing around the kitchen filling containers. Turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, vegetables, rolls, and slices of pie. Emily wrote simple notes on small cards. Nothing sentimental. Just happy Thanksgiving weekend from the Bennetts. Where are we taking these? Karen asked. I had a short list. Mr. Peterson lived for streets away and had lost his wife that spring. Mrs. Alvarez was recovering from surgery and had not been able to cook. 2 meals would go to the fire station because several firefighters had worked through Thanksgiving. Another would go to a woman named Cheryl who had recently started working evenings at the pharmacy. David looked at the list. How do you know all this? People talk. People tell you everything. That is because I do not repeat most of it. Susan gave him a pointed look. Unlike Thomas. We laughed. Around 9:30, we loaded the food into 2 cars. I expected my children to treat the deliveries like a task that needed finishing. Instead, something changed after the first stop. Mr. Peterson invited us inside for coffee and showed Emily photographs of his late wife. Mrs. Alvarez insisted on giving Susan a jar of homemade jam even though we were bringing her dinner. At the fire station, Marcus acted surprised to see us even though I suspected he had already heard we were coming. Each visit took longer than necessary because people talked. That was the point. By noon, the containers were gone. On the drive home, David was unusually quiet. What are you thinking about? I asked. Yesterday. That narrows it down. He kept his eyes on the road. I have been telling myself I am busy for about 15 years. You are busy. So is everybody. He paused. I think I started treating being busy like permission not to notice things. I did not answer immediately. There are moments when a parent should offer wisdom, and moments when silence allows an adult child to hear himself more clearly. When Thomas said all those people cared about you, I was surprised. David continued. That bothers me. Why? Because I should not have been surprised. We stopped at a red light. He looked at me. Mom, I did not know all these people cared about you. The sentence was almost identical to what I had expected him to say eventually, but hearing it still hurt. Not because he meant anything cruel by it. Because he truly had not known. I knew, I said. He looked back toward the road. I just thought my family did too. The light turned green, but David did not move until the car behind us gave a polite tap of the horn. Neither of us spoke for the remaining mile. When we reached the house, Susan and Emily were already there. David carried the empty containers inside and began washing them without being asked. Nobody apologized again. I was grateful for that. An apology repeated too many times can become another way of asking the hurt person to provide comfort. Instead, they stayed. Susan helped me put the dining room back together. Emily wrote down the names of people who had brought dishes so we could return everything. David repaired the loose hinge on one of my kitchen cabinets that I had mentioned 6 months earlier and he had forgotten about. These were small things. That was exactly why they mattered. Before everyone left that afternoon, Emily stood beside the refrigerator with her phone. I made something. Should I be worried? A shared family calendar. I raised an eyebrow. I said I did not want a schedule. It is not a schedule for calling you. She turned the screen toward me. It has birthdays, holidays, appointments people want company for, and family dinners. Nobody gets to assume someone else knows anymore. Susan added, and we are starting a group rule. That sounds dangerous. If somebody cannot come to something, they tell everyone. Not just one person. David nodded. No more imaginary someone else. I looked at the 3 of them standing in my kitchen. 24 hours earlier, each had believed another person would be sitting beside me. Now they were building a system to make sure assumption never replaced attention again. Fine, I said. But I reserve the right to ignore the calendar. Emily smiled. Granted. After they left, the house became quiet again. This time the silence felt different. I carried a cup of tea into the living room and sat beside George's photograph. Outside, the last autumn leaves moved along the sidewalk. I thought about the previous day and realized the town had given my family something more valuable than embarrassment. They had given them perspective. Nobody had lectured David or Susan. Nobody had accused Emily. People had simply shown up, and by showing up, they revealed the space my family had accidentally left empty. My phone buzzed. It was a message from David. Sunday dinner at my place next week. No excuses. I smiled and typed back that I would bring pie. Before I could set the phone down, another message appeared. It was from Thomas. He wanted his folding chairs back eventually. I told him I was considering keeping them as evidence. He replied that I might need them next Thanksgiving. At the time, I thought he was joking. I had no idea how right he was. By the following Thanksgiving, nobody in my family was willing to leave anything to assumption. David called me in September to ask what size turkey he should order. September. I said. Are you planning to raise it yourself? I am being prepared. You are being ridiculous. Last year cured me of improvising. Susan volunteered to handle the side dishes, although she still asked me for my green bean casserole recipe twice because she lost the first copy. Emily announced that she would make pumpkin pie from scratch. I reminded her what happened to the pie she made with her friends the year before. I have improved, she said. That is what people say before serving bad pie. The shared family calendar had survived the entire year, but the calendar itself mattered less than what happened around it. David started calling most Sunday evenings. Not every Sunday, and I preferred it that way. Routine was useful, but I never wanted affection to feel like punching a time clock. Susan began visiting about once a month, sometimes with Mark and sometimes alone. We went to lunch, walked through antique stores, or simply sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee. Emily called whenever she had news, including news that was not particularly important. I learned about broken appliances, difficult co-workers, a neighbor who played music too loudly, and her continuing inability to keep a houseplant alive. More importantly, they began asking about my life too. Not only whether I needed anything, but what I had done that week, who I had seen, what book I was reading, and whether Thomas was still interfering in everybody's business. He was. Some things should never change. When Thanksgiving morning arrived, I came downstairs at 6 expecting to begin cooking and discovered David already in my kitchen. He was wearing an apron that had belonged to George and staring suspiciously at a 16-pound turkey. How did you get in? I asked. You gave me a key 20 years ago. I may reconsider that decision. He pointed at the turkey. I need supervision. You need coffee. By 8, Susan and Mark arrived carrying enough groceries to suggest they expected 50 people. Karen followed with 2 casseroles, and Emily appeared shortly before 10 holding a pumpkin pie like it was a championship trophy. It survived the drive, she announced. That is the first test. Grandma. It looks beautiful. It actually did. Around 11, the doorbell rang. Thomas stood outside carrying folding chairs. I stared at him. I returned those 11 months ago. I know. Then why are they back? Tradition. Behind him stood Linda and her husband. Farther down the walkway, Marcus was helping Harold out of a car. Rachel and her husband were crossing the street with a covered dish. I turned toward David. What did you do? He looked far too pleased with himself. We invited a few people. How many is a few? That depends on how flexible you are with mathematics. Susan appeared behind him. Mom, last year the town made room for us at your Thanksgiving. We thought this year we should make room for them. I looked through the doorway again. More people were arriving, but this time nobody was responding to an emergency. Nobody had heard that Maggie Bennett had been forgotten. They had been invited weeks earlier. Thomas lifted the folding chairs. Can I come inside before my hands freeze? Only because I want the chairs. By noon, my house was full again. Folding tables extended from the dining room into the living room. There were nearly 20 of us, some related by blood and others connected by years of ordinary kindness. David carved the turkey. Susan managed the side dishes. Emily guarded her pumpkin pie from Thomas, who kept threatening to test it before dinner. Karen poured drinks while Mark found places for coats. I did almost nothing, which was surprisingly difficult. Sit down, Mom, Susan told me for the 4th time. I am sitting. You are standing beside a chair. That is almost sitting. She put both hands on my shoulders and guided me into it. George would have enjoyed that. Before we ate, David stood at the end of the table. He was not someone who usually made speeches, and the uncomfortable expression on his face proved it. Last Thanksgiving, he began, my family learned something we should have understood much earlier. I immediately shook my head. David, nobody needs the entire story. I think they know the story, Mom. Thomas raised his hand. Some of us were there. Everyone laughed. David continued. We learned that loving someone and showing up for them are not always the same thing. We loved Mom. We just kept assuming someone else would be the one standing beside her. Susan looked toward me. Emily reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The people in this room showed us what showing up looks like, David said. So thank you. There was no dramatic applause. I was grateful for that. Thomas simply said, "Can we eat now?" and everyone laughed again. Plates began moving around the table. Conversations overlapped. Somebody asked for gravy. Someone else wanted another roll. Emily finally cut her pie, and I admitted it was excellent, although I told her excessive praise would damage her character. Sitting there, I realized something I had misunderstood. The year before, the town had not replaced my family. That was never the lesson. Family and community were not competing for seats at the same table. The table could simply become larger. Later that afternoon, after everyone had eaten far too much, I stood in the kitchen looking through the doorway. David was talking with Marcus. Susan and Linda were exchanging recipes. Emily was showing Rachel photographs on her phone. Thomas was wrapping leftover pie without asking permission. The house was noisy, crowded, and imperfect. It felt exactly right. A year earlier, I had believed the saddest part of Thanksgiving was sitting at a table alone. I was wrong. Loneliness was painful, but being forgotten was something different. Nobody in my family had stopped loving me. They had simply allowed love to become an assumption. And assumptions are dangerous because they require nothing from us. They do not make phone calls. They do not drive 90 miles. They do not knock on doors carrying sweet potatoes and folding chairs. People do those things. Before dinner ended, I looked around the table at relatives, neighbors, old friends, and people whose lives had crossed mine in ways I had almost forgotten. George had been right all those years ago. Thanksgiving should last longer than one Thursday. So should gratitude. So should kindness. And most of all, so should the simple habit of showing up for the people we say we love.